Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're going to give you just a few more moments for everybody to hop on. My name is Stephanie Driscoll, and I am the Creative Services Librarian at the Schaumburg Library. Welcome, everyone. So we are doing this program as part of our Bias and Situs exhibit at the library. So if you haven't been to the library and seen that exhibit, definitely stop by and check it out. It takes up 2 floors. It's a massive exhibit on loan from us from the Smithsonian, and it is here through June 27th. So for tonight's program, we do have Dr. Corey Yeager. So it looks like we actually just lost him for a second. So hopefully he is able to pop right back on. He might have been having some technical difficulties, but he's going to talk to us all about bias. So here he is, Dr. Corey Yeager. And then Corey, if you wanted to get started, welcome to the library. We're so glad to have you this evening. So Dr. Yeager, you can take it away. Oh, it looks like he's still on mute.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the technology is a beast. I'm learning more and more every day. Stephanie, I appreciate it. I just want to first of all say thank you for everyone's flexibility and joining us today and hosting and being part of this conversation. I think it's an extremely important conversation that we're all having and being a part of. And when we talk about bias, there's so many aspects of bias and how it may operate in our lives that is really important for us to discuss. I know that so many of you have been a part of these discussions and learning so many aspects of this discussion. And I'm extremely excited to be able to share with you kind of our learn and what we've been up to. So I'm going to share my screen so you all can see this PowerPoint that I'll be pulling up, and we'll get started. And one thing that I also want to say is, as we go through this, if you have questions, comments, concerns as we go, you're more than welcome to kind of chime in. I think Stephanie's going to help us manage this process as we go. So if you have questions, you can chime in, and if it's in the chat or anything, I think that's just an easy way for us to kind of move forward. So without further ado, let me share my screen and we can get started. Host participant. There you go. So can you guys see my screen or no?
You know, try it one more time. I just made you co-host again. So
okay.
Yeah, try it one more time.
All right, let me try it again. Share my screen. There we go. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Stephanie, you can see? Okay.
Uh-huh.
All right, so let's get started. So I'm Corey Yeager. I'm going to give you just a little brief background on who I am and kind of what brought me to this conversation today. There'll be a number of things that we'll discuss. There'll be a short video that I'll play, but I want to let you get to know a bit about me before we get going, and then we'll kind of move through this conversation. So I'm married. I've been married for 20 years. I have 4 boys. They keep me extremely busy. 2 of them have just went off to college. We just had a huge grad party, so I'm excited about that. They're football players, as was I many, many years ago. You could tell by the gray that it wasn't recently. I helped create an office in the Minneapolis public school system called the Office of Black Student Achievement. And really it's focused on Black male achievement is what we began with. And we moved to doing work with both young men and women. We call them kings and queens. I'm extremely proud of that work. I was doing that for a number of years. I hold a PhD from the University of Minnesota. I am by craft, by trade, a licensed marriage and family therapist, a psychotherapist. My current work is with the Detroit Pistons in the NBA. So I am doing relational systemic contextual support for players and their organization. I do a lot of work with multiple organizations, but I'm really excited about the work that I've done with the Bias Inside Us. and the work that they're up to. I think it's really deeply rooted in understanding. One thing that I'm continuously talking about is that before we can move to solutions about anything, bias or anything else, we must first have a good frame of understanding. And that's what this work is about, is understanding and awareness. So I think the other piece that I would emphasize as we get started here is the issue in the conversation around race and bias in this country has been decontextualized. And by that, I mean that if we shrink context, if we don't have a context on these conversations, it helps us avoid tough convos. It helps us avoid it. Because if I don't understand more deeply and broadly the context that brings us into these conversations, it's easy to avoid them. This conversation and the conversation similar to this is about contextualizing where we are individually and collectively. So I think that's just a frame that I'll probably come back to, but I think it's something that we will discuss a lot. So as we go through this, some quick tools that I utilize anytime I talk about bias or race or discrimination is that we want to speak our truth. So when we have opportunities for you to share, speak your truth. We're going to isolate the concept of race and culture. I think there's tons of different concept pieces that we can discuss in terms of bias, but for this conversation, we want to really focus in and hone in on the isolation of race and culture. We want to be comfortable with the uncomfort. And by that, I mean, I walk through this world with this complexion, 6'3", 300 pounds, given the day and time. If I have a good meal, it may be 310. That's just kind of how it operates for me. But that can be uncomfortable. And I have learned to sit with that discomfort. I think these conversations as well, that they may be uncomfortable, but we have to sit with that discomfort. That discomfort is an indication of growth. Anytime that we grow, it's not necessarily comfortable. So how do we find the ability to sit with that discomfort? My grandmother used to say, "Hey, son, a closed mouth don't get fed." Meaning we have to chime in. That's how we learn, that we have to exchange and engage with one another and open our mouth and our minds to these thoughts and concepts. And we're not going to solve the world's problems in this session. That's not what we're attempting to do. We're attempting to better understand things that impact us on a daily basis. Those are some quick tools that we'll utilize as we go through this convo. So by the end of this conversation, you're going to have some tools to consider the impact of race and implicit bias and its day-to-day impact on personal beliefs, professional choices, and specifically as it relates to race and culture. Also, you want to gain a sense of the current and blossoming research on implicit bias and how we can move that and parlay that knowledge into our benefit. This is equating to this concept that I've already touched on of awareness. How can we become more aware? And this conversation will elicit that awareness. So one thing that I also touch on, I think is extremely important, is that this is not a new conversation. There have been tons of people over many, many years that have touched on and discussed things. So one person that I stand on the shoulders of is James Baldwin. He came out, there was a movie a couple of years ago, I Am Not Your Negro. That was based on James Baldwin's work. And a couple of pieces that really frame what this conversation will be is this first one. It says, "Nobody is more dangerous than he who imagines himself pure in heart, for his purity by definition is unassailable." So if I say, I am really supportive of the feminist movement, you can't really assail that. There's nothing you can do. You have to kind of take that as my purity of heart. But if I take that stance, then if you can't engage with that, then we're left to just assume that my purity is in place. I think that's important for us to understand when we talk about these concepts. And the last one is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Bias is clearly one of those concepts that we must face if we want to move and change it. So the first piece that I'll touch on is, how are we combating our biases? And the follow-up question to that is, are we? Many times we're not. We haven't touched it. We haven't thought about it deeply. So we may not even be combating the bias because we're not clear on if we hold it and And if we do, how does it show up in our lives? So the first question that I want us to ponder, you don't necessarily have to answer it out loud or in the chat, but I want you to think about it. Have you spent time looking at your own racially based attitudes and behaviors as they may contribute to or combat racism around or within you? So I put this word mirror. I think we do a pretty decent job in our lives of looking out the window of our lives on issues of bias and race, meaning that we can look out and say, oh my goodness, that group of people is really struggling. I hope things get better for them. That's looking out the window. Looking in the mirror is saying, who am I in the context of bias? How is this impacting my life and those around me? That's much heavier lifting work to do, is to look in that mirror. That's what I'm asking us to do today on this journey. And the next piece, have I aggressively sought out more information to enhance my own awareness and understanding of racism and bias? Talking with others, reading, listening about this issue, this concept of bias, challenging ourselves to do more of that work. And if you think about your place of employment or the work that you do outside of your home, is it a target for your educational efforts in responding to issues of race, racism, bias? I think if we're going to combat an issue or engage in a conversation, we want to be able to ask ourselves these heavy hitting questions. That doesn't mean you'll have an answer to them necessarily from the beginning, but these are questions that we want to be considerate of. So we're going to play a quick video. Stephanie's going to help us. And really, this is the beginning of this conversation that will lay a foundation, a framework of what implicit bias is, sounds, and feels like. So Stephanie, when you're ready, we're going to play this quick 2-minute video. After this would be a space that I'd love for us to exchange just a bit. So Stephanie, when you're ready, I'm ready.
Okay, give me 1 second. I will pull it up. Let me make sure.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's the wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up. And says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been, she goes, no, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the two white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. And it's totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds, she goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
Thank you, Steph. So I want us to think about that. I think this is a very powerful video that depicts bias. Oftentimes there's arguments. I've probably watched this video. I've watched it hundreds of times, and it's every time I listen to it, I'm in the line with Dr. DeGray. So the woman that was speaking, her name is Dr. Joy DeGray. She is one of the preeminent African-American scholars in the country. Her description of standing in this grocery store line and what occurred is a critical depiction of what we're up to in terms of understanding and discussing the concepts of bias. So a couple of questions that I have that I want you to think about are, what stands out in that clip? Does anything stand out or resonate with you as you watched and listened to that? What moved you? Was there any frame that moved you from that? And the argument of, was that explicit bias or implicit bias that we witnessed? There's a continuous argument that I usually have with people back and forth. Like, I think that was more explicit than implicit. I would move to say that the checker didn't think through this. This was just occurring. She saw a black woman. She began to ask this line of questions that she didn't with this woman that appeared to be white. So I don't think it was explicit. I think it was implicit. There's an argument that could be held there. But this final piece, that you see here, how might our white allies leverage their privileges on behalf of Black and brown, I say students or folks that we work with every day? Because one thing that we know about privilege is once you hold it, you don't want to give it up. There is no privilege in my life that I want to give up. But before I can move to support and leverage my privilege, I must first understand that I hold certain privileges. This is the root and concept of bias. So these are questions that have, Stephanie, I don't know if you have anybody that has questions. Did anything come through there?
Not yet, but will you just pause for a second and just kind of go over for our patrons, what is the difference between explicit bias and implicit bias?
So explicit is a bias that I know I'm moving with. I'm biased against that group because I don't like them. I was told that this group is a negative, they're lazy, whatever frame you want to have on that, that's explicit. I know that I hold a bias against a certain group. Implicit bias, unconscious bias, is a bias that says, well, I don't realize that I'm doing anything. So this movement between conscious and unconscious is really this explicit and implicit. So recognizing that we have these explicit biases in our lives that we move with every day, that we're pretty decently aware of. Implicit bias is really this space of, I didn't realize that I was doing anything that what could be formed or seen as being biased. So the mind, the brain is extremely powerful. I tell my players that I work with all the time that the body follows the mind. Whatever I tell my body, my mind, my body will follow. This is moving this unconscious frame into a more conscious understanding. This is what we seek. When I talk about awareness, I'm saying, hey, can we start to play with engaging and better understanding who we are as individuals and start to tap into some of this implicit unconscious space? That's when that awareness moves us into a deeper frame of understanding. This aspect of leveraging those privileges is first to understand that we hold them. I can't leverage anything if I don't know I have it. And one of the things about privilege is I don't want to discuss this. I don't want to think about it. So in terms of privilege, one thing that I utilize, a metaphor that I utilize, is at 6'3", 300 pounds, I have size privilege. My wife is 4'11". She argues that she's 4'11". She's really like 4'10" and 3/4, but I'll leave that for her argument. So when I move through this world and my wife is with me and my sons are with me, I know that I have size privilege and that no one's really going to mess with my wife or my kids when they see me. So I'm leveraging that privilege on behalf of my family. As we move, if we go to the state fair, if we're in big crowds, I use that on behalf of my kids and my wife. So that's me recognizing my privilege and utilizing it in a way that benefits those around me. So if we can start in a way to understand our privileges and start to play with these biases in a way that we're getting a frame of awareness and understanding, we then can take that next step of saying, all right, so how can I use that to help? Because I think that we continuously, we profess a move or profess a frame of, I want to be helpful, but I don't know how to, right? I want to use whatever I have to be helpful to a group that may not have that. And I think that is something that we want to discuss and utilize more often. We want to become more aware, if that makes sense. So if we didn't have questions, Stephanie, no questions?
We have, we just got some feedback.
Okay.
What stands out to me is it was a mixed race woman that came to the rescue.
Mm-hmm.
The two white women did not do anything until they saw Kathleen speak up.
Yes.
They possibly did not realize Kathleen was part Black.
Yes.
Kathleen really was understanding what was happening.
Yes, so we use this frame, that's a great piece, that we use this piece of rescue. And what oftentimes can happen is our white allies will say, I don't want to get in the middle of this. But in my mind, I'm saying, this is not right that they did that this checker is treating them differently. It's not right, but I don't want to get in the way. And so oftentimes we'll stand back, even though we're thinking something's not right. But Martin Luther King talked about complicity, right? That if I don't say anything, my silence is complicit, that I am almost writing a check of agreement with my silence. That also, sometimes when we chime in, our concern may be, this person of color may not want me to say anything. But I think that the piece that we must more deeply understand is that it's not about me drawing agreement from this person of color that I'm moving to support, rescue, whatever frame you want, but it's about humanity. That my humanity tells me there is a wrong, an injustice that's moving in front of me, and I'm going to speak on that injustice. So I think also rescue can be this piece that's deeply connected to white guilt, white fragility, those pieces that no one is looking for a savior. People of color are not looking for anyone to save them. But we are, as I say that, we are also looking for folks that will be supportive and be helpful, especially in situations that arise. So I think that question is a great frame. Did you have another one, Stephanie, or no?
That's all we have for right now.
Okay, perfect. So if there's others that come up, we can surely go back to that, but I'm going to move into this. So if we look at this piece of how the brain works, the roots of modern human thought reach hundreds of thousands of years into the past. And our brains have developed a variety of ingrained intuitions. We all have these intuitions. We can say, man, I didn't really have information, but my intuition told me something. Well, that has come through many, many years of the brain firing synapses in a certain way that tell us things. We can think about bias and intuition in a way that says it keeps us out of trouble and struggle. My intuition tells me to be avoidant of certain things because it can be about my own safety. But those thought patterns and that cognition that occurs is the heart of this implicit bias or unconscious bias. And it's designed to keep us, that gene pool moving and to keep us safe. So bias in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? So I think too often we move to say, well, this implicit bias is all negative. It's not all negative. And it's not about being racist or not racist. It's not, because there's, again, as I said from the beginning, there are so many differing categories of bias that we can recognize, understand, and fall into. This survival instinct that the brain has developed over these hundreds of thousands of years is extremely important. So if we can start to point out and engage and do really kind of our own self-reflective process, we will start to have things that come up that we can question and be curious about with ourselves. The most important curiosity that I can hold as a therapist is not my curiosity that I engage with others around, but more of the curiosity that I hold with who I am and how I got to be who I am and where I'm at. So finding the ability to be curious with ourselves is a space that we want to occupy. So my world, my doctoral work is in the realm of social science. And what does social science tell us about bias? Well, children begin to acquire stereotypes and prejudices as toddlers. As a young child, we begin to engage in this. Studies show as early as age 3, children pick up terms of racial prejudice without really understanding them or their significance. What we also know about bias, and the social sciences have told us this, is that once that they're learned or embraced, they resist change. Bias doesn't want change. Even when evidence fails to support them or points to the contrary, we'll still hold on to them. So we're going to begin to kind of play more into the research on implicit bias. And I'll tell a quick story here. Part of the brain is the hippocampus. And really what the hippocampus is the filing system, the secretary of the brain. So for instance, if you are sitting in your office or your home and you're looking for a pen to write something down, and you usually don't write in a red pen, but this day you grab a red pen and you begin to write, and the phone rings at the same time. You take the call and you get horrible news. And you go about your day and you handle it. And 6 months later, you catch yourself writing in a red pen and you feel awful. Well, this is the brain connecting those two worlds. It's connecting. The last time you used a red pen, you got horrible news. So this is, again, we're starting to discover more deeply how the brain associates pieces. So it's doing its job continuously. This is bias. It's continuously working. And if we can better understand how the brain is associating things that we don't associate consciously, we can better frame that. There's a story of a little girl that walks with her grandmother all the time. And as she walks down the street, she recognizes as a little 7-year-old girl that every time her grandma sees a black or brown man, she clutches her purse more tightly and moves to the other side and grabs her granddaughter more closely. Well, that means she's teaching her granddaughter something that is implied only, that it wasn't consciously saying, hey, when you see this group of people, you're supposed to be nervous. It is implied. So the hippocampus stores that information. And then this little 7-year-old girl, when she's 25, may have a sense of, I get nervous with black men. That's the brain working. That's implicit unconscious bias creating itself. And this is housed in the hippocampus. So what is bias? It's ingrained, as I said before. It's adjustable, so we can change it. but it's oftentimes unconscious. So it's applied most often to the concepts of race, gender, and age. And how is bias activated? Well, it's most often activated by stress, time pressure, multitasking, lack of knowledge or information. So if you look at that final bullet point of where bias is activated, we live in a world that is full of stress, time pressure, and constraints. We're always multitasking, and very seldom do we have a wealth of knowledge or information about a group or individuals. So what bias seeks is to move you to your default thinking. It wants to move you to your default thinking. We don't have time when we're multitasking or under time pressure to say, all right, so why am I doing this? And why am I thinking this certain way about this group of people? So recognizing that this is a space where bias will oftentimes house itself, find itself, this may be an indicator that if I'm feeling some of these stresses and time pressures and multitasking, I could well be moving with implicit or unconscious bias. I think that frame is an important frame that allows us, when those pieces are unraveling, that if we can find the ability to slow down a bit and say, all right, let me ask myself some questions. Let me be curious about why I'm thinking or feeling a certain way. This is the cornerstone of changing or engaging or understanding this aspect of bias, if that makes sense. So a piece that I'm talking more deeply about these days is the concept of cognitive dissonance. We've all heard it tons of times, but what is that? I frame cognitive dissonance as the cousin of implicit bias. And what do I mean by that? Well, what is this? Cognitive dissonance is the mental stress or discomfort experienced when holding two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values at the same time. Well, what we want to do, we don't want that dissonance. We don't want that stress that comes when we hold two conflicting beliefs. Because what we know in terms of dissonance is that only one of those battles will win. That if I get information that's new, that is counter to the belief system that I hold, both of them can't operate together. So we'll quickly stick with that almost innate default thinking. This is implicit bias. Confronted by new information that conflicts with these existing beliefs and ideas or values is when this dissonance really occurs. This concept came from an Algerian psychologist and philosopher, Frantz Fanon. He coined this concept. I think that if we can move to a cognitive dissonance, that means it's no longer implicit. It's no longer unconscious. If I'm battling with something, then it's no longer unconscious. So we want to invite this dissonance, and it's almost contradictory to what we would normally think or believe. I want to invite in that dissonance, because if I can at least have the battle in my head, I can begin to choose a new way of thinking. But with absent that battle, I'm just going to move with that bias. I'm going to move with that implied or unconscious way of thinking. So we want to invite this dissonance in, as opposed to when that dissonance occurs, pushing it away. Because when I push it away, I'll go to the default. So recognizing when this occurs, that I'm no longer unconscious about it, and I can start to play with it. Does that mean that we'll start to make the right and better choices every time? No. Sometimes that dissonance occurs. I'm still going to choose the more quote unquote negative journey. But if we can begin to play with it more often, I'll then at least understand, okay, I can do something different here. I can choose a different way of going about this. I think this is an important aspect of the work. Any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts as we're going? Anything, Stephanie?
Not yet, but everyone, again,
Okay.
feel free, use the Q&A box or the chat box. This definitely, the conversation definitely can go a little bit deeper and get a little bit better, and we can kind of tailor it to exactly what you're thinking the more that you guys chime in. So we're happy to have you guys definitely join in on the conversation. So we do have another Q&A right now. So
Yep.
if in the previous video, how would the cashier feel about dissonance? Would she defend herself, accept and be gracious? Like, how does dissonance work in that past video?
So the dissonance in that situation would occur after the fact. So you can best believe that in that video we watched, the situation occurred and then it figured itself out however it did. But then that checker, the next time she's on shift and a situation similar occurs, she's going to say, uh-oh, this reminds me of what happened last week. Now the battle ensues. So that's that dissonance. Now I'm starting to fight with myself. So it's my point from earlier that I may still say, give me 2 forms of ID, but now I'm aware of it. Now that if that battle ensues, I'm aware. So what we seek is that maybe that checker next time, 3 times later, does something different. I'm not going to ask for 2 forms of ID because I didn't ask the person in front of them. So now at least we're starting to move that piece in a way that we're aware. So hopefully that touches on the question that was posed. That's a great question. And I think that helps us better understand how we can move this unconscious to a more conscious frame. So if we think about cognitions, how the brain is working, how it's functioning, this little piece here I think is extremely important, and it's simple, but I think it helps us better understand how the brain is functioning. So what we're taught creates beliefs, right? From a young age, you're taught something, and then you create a belief system from that. And those beliefs create attitudes. So if I have a certain frame of belief about something that has been created from what I was taught, I'll then begin to have a certain attitude about a group. I don't like them. That's negative. Those attitudes move us to feelings. My attitude about something creates a feeling of negativity, sadness, disappointment about that group. And those feelings now ultimately move me into action. So that checker, you could best believe, had a belief system and had a certain attitude and feelings about a group of people, probably not aware of them at all. But the action of being in the line and asking for 2 forms of ID is ultimately what we saw or heard in that conversation and story that Dr. DeGrasse shared. But you can see how those beliefs move us to action. I think understanding how those cognitions are created and how they play out in our day-to-day life is really something that will help us move. So just those short and brief frames. And Stephanie, I'm gonna give you this PowerPoint. So if folks are thinking about some of this and you didn't catch it all, I'll share this with Stephanie. And if you have questions or comments or concerns that you want to go back through, it'll be available for you all to engage with if you want. So what does the research on implicit bias tell us? So social science and neuroscience have begun to be bedfellows. This is new. In the last 10 years, they've kind of converged. The concept of bias and race is something that we've in the past said, well, you can't prove this. It's just kind of a feeling thing. That's no longer the case. Neuroscience is moving the social science realm forward in terms of bias. So this is a study that I think is really, really important. 2004, Ohio State, a psychologist named Will Cunningham began to measure white research participants' brain activity using the fMRI. It's an imaging system that shows us how the brain is operating. And what he did was he put people, 30 participants in front of a computer screen, and he flashed pictures of faces, black and white faces. So he flashed them for 30 milliseconds. So you can imagine how fast that was moving. So what did they find? They found that there was greater activity in the amygdala when participants saw black or brown faces. Well, what is the amygdala? Well, it's the fear center, the emotional center of the brain. The amygdala is fully developed at about 8 months of gestation. For instance, a pregnant woman, that if you walk up to a pregnant woman that's 8 months pregnant and slap your hands in front of the stomach, the baby will be startled because the amygdala is fully developed. The fear center is fully developed. So that this fMRI would fire show the amygdala firing anytime a brown face showed up. So an interesting aspect of this research was when Will Cunningham searched out these participants, he gave them a couple of pieces that you had to kind of jump this hurdle to be able to be part of this research, that you had to be a liberal and anti-racist. You had to see yourself as liberal and anti-racist is what he did. So when the amygdala begins to fire and the fear center fires when they see black or brown faces, it would be the participants that were saying, I'm anti-racist and I'm liberal. So I'm not supposed to be scared of those faces. But the brain would fire and say, well, you are. You have a fear when you see these faces. So the second piece of the study, I think, to me, is quite interesting. What he did was he paused those pictures for like half a second. So instead of 30 millisecond flashes, he would bring the picture up for half a second and then move it on. So the findings were similar with an addition, that if they saw a black or brown face, the amygdala would quickly fire. Fear would fire up in the brain. But then it would subside because it was staying for half a second. It would subside and the prefrontal cortex would take over. Well, what is the prefrontal cortex? It is the mediating center of the brain, the long-term consequence center of the brain. So if I've told myself the story of I'm anti-racist and I have a liberal space of belief, then my mind is saying, hey, you're not supposed to be scared of those faces. Don't do that. But the primal instinct, the beginning instinct was fear, right? Even though I consciously have told myself the story and others that I'm not nervous and I'm supportive and anti-racist, the brain is firing differently. So this, I think, is an extremely important aspect of the work, that we can profess a certain thing, but the brain may be doing something absolutely 180 degrees opposite of what I profess consciously. So this importance of this subconscious, unconscious understanding is starting to come to the forefront, that this neuroscience is able now to tell us a new story that challenges the existence of what we consciously may be holding. So I think this is one piece of research that I think it gives us a better understanding of how powerful the brain is and what it's doing at an unconscious level, at a subconscious level. I think this is an important, really cornerstone, seminal piece of research that is helping us more deeply understand how implicit bias is operating and what we may be able to do about it. Any questions or anything that has come up before I move on?
No, but I was just thinking that's really interesting to me. So implicit bias is something that's going to be there, right? And the fear with the faces is something that's going to be there. And so
Yes.
You're kind of saying that the more that people, I don't know, get knowledgeable or get out and ask questions or become more comfortable around these things, do you think that can then overtake?
Yes. Yes. So and I have a slide. I don't know if it's the next one. No, that what we can do is begin to override these subconscious, unconscious processes by starting to acknowledge, okay, so maybe I am thinking differently at a level below my consciousness. So we can consciously begin to override. So that checker, as she moved on 2 months later, she may start to consciously override this piece of asking for 2 forms of ID, because she could be curious with herself. Why am I doing that? Because I don't do that when I see the white patrons that walk through. I never think about asking them for 2 forms of ID or pulling the bad checkbook out. I don't think about it. But now that I've been challenged with this and I have a dissonance, I can consciously say I'm not going to do it. This would be a time normally I would. I'm not going to do that this time. If we consciously override a belief system enough times, I may start to change my implicit associations with that certain group. If I do it enough, I may start to come to an understanding of, yeah, I think that's a belief system that I've held that I don't think I want to hold anymore. But I wasn't clear or understood that I even had that. I think this is really a process. Again, this is not a program where you can just change it, but first being aware and then being able to consciously override my belief system is a challenge, but it's something that we can do, right? There's a great psychologist, Claude Steele, and he talks about these studies indicate that African-American teenagers are aware they're stigmatized as being intellectually inferior and that they go to their school settings bearing what he calls a burden of suspicion. So you can imagine, even Joy DeGruy in that grocery store, I think about it all the time. They're going to see me as something. They're going to see me as being negative. They're going to have a suspicion that I'm going to try to pass a bad check. So now folks of color move through this world knowing, hey, that I'm suspicious of how they view me. So the initial step in addressing this implicit bias, similar to what Stephanie just brought up, is that we have to admit that these biases are learned early and they're counter to our commitment to fair and just treatment for all people. That if we profess we need fair and just treatment for everyone, that is now a challenge. But I have to first admit, hey, there's probably some learned behavior that I have deeply held that I'm not really clear on, right? So figuring out first that I do hold these biases, and now I get to push myself in a new way. It takes a lot of work. And oftentimes we don't want to do that work, or we're not armed with the tools to do that work. This awareness is the tool that will allow us to push back on that space. I think this is important, especially with our white peers and colleagues. Bias is not about being racist. If we're looking at the racial frame, bias is not about that. So it may give us just even a little relief to say, okay, so this is not about me being called or seen as racist, but it's my mind, my brain doing what the brain has been taught to do over many, many years. So they're not a sign of a bad person. We all have them. Once we've accepted that, it allows us to talk about these issues in a more non-judgmental way. That's an initial move. Moreover, what is bad is not trying to understand what your unconscious biases are, right? This is the bad part about it. If I don't attempt to do that, I'm really framing, I'm going to stay where I'm at. So if we're on this conversation today and you've joined in, you've already said, I think I want to better understand this. This is interesting. And I want to individually better understand how these concepts of implicit or unconscious bias may be acting or interacting in my day-to-day existence. This understanding moves us into a space of being able to do something about it, right? It goes back to this piece of dissonance, that we're inviting that dissonance in, because if I have that dissonance, I get to do something with it. So this is, Stephanie, what you were talking about. We have unconscious biases, and that moves us to judgment and behavior. But we can consciously override those biases by challenging ourselves. If we challenge ourselves and consciously override those biases enough, what we'll create is a new or a change in our implicit associations, right? And you can tell just from this simple slide, it's not easy work, but it's not necessarily complex, right? That if I consciously say, I'm going to challenge myself, I'm going to challenge myself. If we do that enough, we may start to create a new version of understanding a group and say, I was wrong. The way that I've seen that group, I don't think it jives with what I consciously have been telling myself. If we do enough of that work, we can start to move the needle. And I think that's what we're all searching for. I know I am, I know a number of us are, and I think that's an important framework. I know that Stephanie, let me just say, if we go long, I'm more than open to stay on the call additional time. I have no nothing that will move me away from this. So just the last few. Cognitive processes versus social constructs. So if we know that bias is a subtle cognitive process, if we counter that by saying, so what is racism? Well, it's a blatant social construct. So it was socially constructed. This myth of race is something that has been constructed over time in our society. And classism is an overt and blatant social construct. But bias is something quite different. It's a cognitive process. It's not a social construct. It's something that the brain is doing, has been trained to do. So we can't see it in the same light as things like racism or classism. It stands alone and separate from those social constructs. I think this is, once again, an important thing or frame that we want to better understand, that we don't want to lump bias into these social constructs like racism or classism. Stands alone, quite different than what those pieces are. So if we know that we have assumptions, those assumptions will move us into our daily practice. So we can ask ourselves the question, to what extent are the assumptions that I hold about people from low income, impoverished, communities of color, how are they seen in the structures and practices of my daily existence? Because if we ask ourselves this question and can be curious with ourselves, we'll start to uncover what these assumptions and practices are in our lives. Again, this speaks to or points to the process of change. In the social sciences, we all think we can talk and discuss change. And there are two versions of change that we have to better understand. We call them in the social science realm, first and second order change. So the metaphor that I best can describe in terms of when we want to change something in your home, if you look around your home, first order change would be walking into your home saying, I'm going to take out all the furniture, take everything off the wall, repaint, get new furniture, move it around in a different manner, and put new pictures up. That's change. That's first order change. Second order change is a more deeply rooted change that says, I'm looking around the home, I'm knocking that wall down because I want to forever change the structure of this space. We have to be curious with ourselves, what level of change are we looking for? Because I can just profess, hey, I'm going to be different, I'm going to do something different, or I'm going to really completely change the structure of how I operate. I think this is a battle that we'll have, and we have to be able to be honest with ourselves on what change that we seek. I think it's a really important piece as well. This is something that you can write down. Again, once again, I'm gonna share the PowerPoint with Stephanie, but the IAT, it's an implicit association test. Harvard study came up with it. There's a ton of different bias checks that you can do. If you just Google implicit association test, IAT, it'll pop up. And it tests all kinds of biases: gender, race, class, age. And the sad piece is I've taken this test in the realm of race tons of times, and I continuously, and this is the work that I do, I continuously find out through this test, man, I'm still holding biases. I'm holding biases against people that look like me. If I walk down the street in North Minneapolis, which Minneapolis is home and the epicenter of racial unrest in this country, if I walk down the street of North Minneapolis and I see a group of 6 African-American boys, something in my mind says, hey, you got to watch that. What are they doing? But those kids could be my nephews or my sons. But I'm still saying, well, I got to watch them. So even though I look like them and I'm doing the work to combat these biases every day, I still hold them. So if that's the case, that means we all are holding these biases, and finding a way to frame them is this an implicit association test. It gives us a better and deeper understanding of some of the biases that we may well hold. So this piece of consciousness, every day, automatic preferences steer us towards less conscious decisions, but they are hard to explain because they remain resistant to the probes of conscious motivation. So this is, again, the struggle that continuously we're going to hold these biases. They're going to move us away from really making better decisions. I use air quotes in terms of better, but this realm of consciousness is really important. What we must also understand is that ignorance is bliss. We've all heard it. But if I don't realize or I'm ignorant to something, I can be blissful about a ton of things. But with consciousness can come almost an anger because I see things differently. I experience things differently because I am now more aware of what's going on in the world around me. So recognizing that, talk about confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is almost saying, all right, I have these biases, and then I'll move through the world seeking to confirm my bias. May not be clear on that, but I move through the world saying, see, look, that's what they're doing. I knew that. So recognizing that we move in such a way is really important. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. I think, and once again, I'll say I'm going to share this with Stephanie so you all can get it, go back through it more slowly if you choose. But think about these things, and I'm not asking you to discuss this now, but the personal reflection of things that resonate with me, things I'll share with someone else that didn't engage in this conversation, and what can I immediately do from this conversation that may help move my own personal individual needle. And then I think, one thing that we have to recognize as well is before I can be part of a collective movement to do anything, I have to first do my individual work. This goes back to this piece of looking in the mirror, to do my own individual work before I can be part of a broader movement. I think that's important. I think this work that we've endeavored upon in this conversation scratches the surface, but it is the beginning of that individualized movement. So, Stephanie, I am more than open to engage, answer any questions that I can as we move forward.
It looks like we have one question here. How do you make stubborn people realize that they have biases that they refuse to see, but it's very apparent to those that they are biased against and it affects them adversely?
So, great question. One thing that I talk about a lot is that this consciousness, this stubbornness that we see in others can elicit an anger in us. When I start to move and better understand something, I could see others that may be stubborn and want to stick with where they are. It can elicit an anger. Well, what we know about anger, what the research tells us about anger, it presents itself in usually one of two ways: very fiery anger or very cold anger. My wife would tell you quickly, I'm a cold, angry person. I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm just pretty cold. Others are fiery. They get angry. They're going to scream and yell and be aggressive. I think one way that answers this question, one thing that we must develop is what I have coined as a warm anger. And what I mean by that is this, that a warm anger is curious. that there will be stubborn people in our lives that we love dearly and that we want to see move into a better space. So a warm anger says, help me understand why you continuously say that. Help me better understand why you see it that way, because I don't see it that way. Now that is rooted in anger. I'm mad and angry that you're doing something or seeing the world in a certain way, but it's not cold, because cold anger shuts it down. Fiery anger really shuts it down, because now we end up arguing about something that's not really the root of the issue. But a warm anger, a curious anger, elicits a conversation. Because if we can move into a conversation, we can learn from one another. So that stubbornness is going to be present, especially in the concepts of race or bias. We know that's going to occur. But if we can find an ability to be curious with our anger, it opens up the opportunity for both parties to learn and move forward.
I like that. That's kind of the best explanation of warm anger.
Mm.
Okay, so we have another question. Can you tell us what you do to counteract your own biases that you were talking about towards the group of Black teens in Minneapolis?
I find myself in those moments trying to slow down and say, Corey, why are you doing that? That's not something you profess to be something. You're working against that. Why are you still holding this bias, this your intuition that's bubbling up that makes you say, what are they up to? So I start to be more curious with myself. And what I'm doing is I'm fighting a cognitive dissonance. I'm arguing with myself back and forth. What are you doing? Well, you want to stay safe. So I think that this concept of being curious consistently and continuously, when things like that boil up, taking the opportunity in the moment. And that's not an easy moment to be curious, because I'm feeling like, hey, I got to keep myself safe and those around me safe. But we can find an opportunity to slow things down. One thing about therapy and therapeutic work is it's really about trying to slow things down, because if I can slow things down, I can start to make better choices. And even if I don't make a better choice, that curiosity allows me to start to think through. And I may still, in that moment, make the choice to move to the other side of the street. But when I get home, I can continue to have that conversation with myself. All right, so what is that? Why are you still doing that? Don't do that next time. And then the next time that I engage in a situation similar, I can say, yeah, there it is. So you were going to do that, but I'm not going to do that. Actually, I'm going to engage. I'm going to go across the street and say, hey, what are you guys up to? A group of young men at midnight. What are you guys doing? What's going on? I can start to challenge that. I can challenge myself to do something different. So that's what I'm doing pretty consistently. But once again, as I said before, this doesn't mean I'm going to make the right choice, quote unquote, right choice all the time. But I'm going to continue to challenge myself to be better in those situations.
So while we're waiting to see if we have any more questions, one thing that I was thinking about that I hear sometimes is when if white people say, well, I'm not racist, I don't see color. Right. Mm-hmm. And so you've kind of touched on it a lot, and it resonated with the Baldwin quote at the very beginning, about professing that you're like pure, and so you can't be. Can you kind of explain why saying I don't see race is problematic? Like, well, I don't see color.
Yeah. So simply, if you get on this Zoom call, before I say a word, unless you have something wrong with your eyes, you see a Black man. So to profess that you don't see color is just at its premise untrue. And the challenge is, Stephanie, we need to see difference. That's diversity. We want diversity of thought, diversity of understanding. It makes us better. It's what we profess as a country to be the cornerstone of our existence. So professing that I don't see color is once again a move to decontextualize race. Get the context out of there. I don't want the context. It's too much for me to think about. So this piece of a colorblind society is a misnomer. I think at some point, probably in its origins years ago, that might have been okay because it was the beginning of trying to do something different. But what we know is that we do see color. So this is not the question. The question is, once I recognize that difference, what do I do with it? What am I up to when I see that difference? This is really the question that we want to have. But I think it's a lazy move to say I don't see color. Because if I don't see color, what I'm really saying somewhere down deep is, what is the default understanding in this country that white may be right? So if I don't see color, I'm saying, hey, so just blend into the way the white society operates and sees it. And if you blend yourself in, then I don't have to deal with the difference. But the fact remains is that we are all different. That there is not a monolithic way of viewing anything or anybody in this country. And that we've got to find a level and ability to be comfortable with difference and recognize that difference is something that is good, as opposed to, I don't see color, that we're all just one big group. It's just not true. Once again, though, I think that it was utilized at some point in a quote unquote positive fashion. But that's not a frame that we need to lean on any longer, because it's just not a true statement. So figuring out ways in which to see the difference, do something positive with that difference is really what I hope that we seek.
Okay, so then it looks like the last question, do you know, have there been studies done on white people shown Asian faces or Black people being shown white faces?
Yeah, so I don't know about the folks shown, I don't recall research on Asian faces. There may be some newer research out there. But there was a study that was done that was Will Cunningham's study, Ohio State. He did a new study, and what he did, the study was exactly the same, but he put Black and brown folks as the participants and showed the pictures. And sad to me is the findings were exactly the same. So Black and brown folks see Black and brown, white faces, the brain, no activity. Black participants saw Black and brown faces, the amygdala fired. It's me walking down the streets of North Minneapolis saying, what are those kids up to? So what is this? Well, this is internalized racism, internalizing bias, that if you are taught that folks that look like you are negative, if you ingest that long enough, it becomes part of your being. So we internalize this issue of bias and race to the point that we, even as Black and brown folks, will be biased against people that look just like us. So that's why I say it's almost, for me, that's almost sad that I'm going to be biased against people that look like me. But it's the fact, that's what the research is telling us. And it's the work that I'm endeavoring upon every day. And when I take that IAT, I see myself saying, man, I'm still struggling with this, but I'm working on it every single day.
Well, Corey, I want to thank you so much. And we got a lot of chats to the panelists just saying thank you and what a wonderful job you did and how thought-provoking this all was. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all this evening. I know I said it before, but once again, I'll share this, Stephanie. I have your email. I'm going to, as soon as we get off, I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you, and anyone that would like to have it and wants to go back through it. Even the clip, the clip is part of the PowerPoint, so you can watch it again. Again, every time you watch it, you hear something different. But I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all. And I'm thankful that we're moving in a direction that's beneficial, and this conversation is a part of that awareness. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much, patrons, for attending, and I hope everyone has a good evening. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.